So, regarding the causes of the Mexican crisis of 1994, we have six main facts that basically affect the development of this crisis. The first fact is the overvalued exchange rate of the peso, which basically means that the Mexican government had maintained a currency peg with the United States. As a result of this, the value of the peso will float in terms of the United States dollar. For example, if the value of the dollar went down by 5%, the Mexican government will conduct forex operations to ensure that the value of the peso also went down by exactly 5%. On the other hand, we have that with the entry in force of the North American Free Trade Agreement (NAFTA) on January 1 of 1994, this caused the liberalization of the financial system and privatizing the largest commercial banks and deregulating the banking system. This basically affected a lot the banking sector of this country and the financial sector. This is one of the causes of the crisis in Mexico. Also, we have that the crisis has its climax during the administration of the President Carlos Salinas. And a lot of economists and politicians said that Mexico undertook large-scale reforms and deregulation of its own economy in the second half of the 1980s, which basically matched with the period of administration of this President Carlos Salinas. That's why they all say that a lot of the bad decision of this guy reflect on the economy and cause the crisis in Mexico. On the other hand, we have with the increasing interest rates in the United States, investors start dumping the dollar denominated in Mexican debt and buying in United States treasuries, which mean that the Mexican debt had no buyers, and this caused the rapid devaluation of the peso. Also, we have that the current deficit reached almost 8% of the GDP between 1993 and 1994. This caused the President Salinas allowed to purchase peso bonus to contrast this effect. Measure that did not work pretty well because it basically impied the international reserve of the Bank of Mexico, because the investors were scared of the uncertainty conditions in terms of politics, social, economy, and financial sectors of this country. So they start selling their treasury bonds of the country in a lower price. Finally, the causes include the fact that the high proportion of the public debt was rolled in short-term conditions, and most of this debt was in hands of the non-residents, which the majority were Americans. And that's why, due to the uncertainty, that's why they start selling the government treasury bills. Thank you.
So I'm going to explain to you the development of the Mexican crisis with a timeline. So it started in 1994. We have the first period from March to November of that year. In that period happened three main things. The first one is that the US Federal Reserve raised its policy rate. The second one was that Mexico suffered from a lot of political homicides because they were in elections. And the third and most important one was that the foreign exchange reserves declined rapidly, and Mexican government want to stop the outflow of foreign currency. So they issues short-term dollar-denominated debt, and it really worked to stop the outflow of foreign currency. The second important time was December 1st of the same year, because it was a new president that was Ernesto Zedilla. And the next, in December 15 of 1994, the new finance minister denies that the Mexican government was going to devalue the peso. But the next day, $855 million leaves the country. On December 20 of the same year, the Mexican government said it was an unsustainable situation. So the central bank announced a lift of the upper band of exchange rate by 15%. That was like an effective devaluation of the peso. The next day, on December 21st of 1994, the $4.6 billion leave the country. That was like half of foreign exchange reserves, a lot of money. And the next day, on December 22 of 1994, there was an intervention of the foreign exchange market, and the peso was allowed to float freely. But at the end of that year, the devaluation was about 35%. And then next year, in 1994, on January, the International Monetary Fund announced a rescue package of $7.8 billion. And 5 days later, the US announced another rescue package, including the International Monetary Fund package. And due to the credit line, Mexico is able to roll over the short-term dollar-denominated debt, but with higher yields. And then finally, in March of 1995, the Mexican government announced a strict austerity package, leading to renewed confidence by investors.
So, when a country goes through a financial crisis, it not only impacts finance, right? The banks, it also impacts society, economy, and many more other areas. However, we are going to focus on two areas. Like I said, society and economy. So, in the economic aspects, of course, investors of the country causing interest rates to increase at a very quick rate, like mentioned before, in the causes and development. This eventually caused a recession in Mexico, and eventually the Mexican government had to depend on the United States' help. It used $13 billion from the US Treasury in order to get out of this recession, get out of this crisis one way or another. And this loan helped stabilize the Mexican economy. Society had felt the blow very, very directly. So, for example, the imports were affected, and this caused living standards for the Mexican population to decrease. It was a very terrible time for Mexican families because they could no longer buy the goods they were buying at a custom price, to a price they were accustomed to when it came to groceries, clothing, and other things. Also, Mexican businesses were affected because their debts were in dollars. So they had to rely on the supplies that would come from the United States. Also, when a company is affected by a crisis like this, they have to fire their employees. They have to have a lot of layoffs. So most employees take this very deeply, very personally, and eventually some people will commit suicide, and this was the case during this crisis.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the consequences of the Mexican peso crisis, also known as the tequila effect. So, as my colleagues already said, Mexico suffered one of its worst recessions in history, which destabilized their financial markets and led to a further depreciation of the Mexican peso. This crisis also affected other economies which were related to Mexico because they had their capitals located inside the country. For example, the US had mutual and pension funds there. So in this slide, we have some indicators that help us verify the situation in Mexico. For instance, the GDP, we can see it decreased an amount of $167 billion from 1984 to 1995. In a year, it decreased an exorbitant amount of money. Also, we see that inflation, on the other hand, it's increasing in a very fast rate, as it was, I believe, 7%, almost 7% in 1994, and in 1995 it reached the number of 35%. Also, unemployment increased in a 2.65% amount in the same period of time, and the exchange rate also increased, like in the sense that the Mexican peso lost its strength because in 1994 a US dollar could be bought with 3.3 Mexican pesos, and in 1995 the Mexicans had to give 6.42 Mexican pesos to get the same dollar. So the situation also led to a bank crisis because of the increase of defaults in 1995 and because of the percentage of non-performing loans as a percentage of the total loans of the banks was alarmingly increasing. So the central bank and the commission and the National Banking Commission began some programs in order to restore the system.
In response to the crisis, the Mexican government had the main challenge of avoiding the collapse of financial and productive systems, also to reestablish the trust of countries' investors. Due to the nature of the crisis, the measures taken were focused on two fronts. The first one was implementation of restrictive fiscal and monetary policies, along with floating exchange rates. This will let the policies to work better because exchange rates give more independence. Now, the second front was to negotiate a deal in order to apply for international support to strengthen confidence on the compliance of Mexico's financial obligations, basically to recover countries' credibility. Now, as the financial sector was about to collapse, there were some measures taken in terms of liquidity and solvency. The first of them is basically the supply to commercial banks of foreign currency in order to mitigate additional pressures on the exchange rate to keep it more controlled and stable. Then it is the effective recapitalization through legal reforms, as they also modified some capitalization norms. Then there is the support for bank debtors, and they led the the credit institutions to intervene. Now, the government also developed three major programs to bail out. The first one is that they created a trust fund named Procapte, that was created with government funds and basically allowed banks to work with a 9% capital ratio in exchange of 5-year obligations from the bank. So they weren't allowed to pay dividends or to issue debt until they repaid these funds. If they didn't pay, the obligations could be converted to our ordinary stock that could be sold by the government in advance. Now, the second program is the special dollar credit window. They created this for banks to pay their debt in dollars. And the third one is that they gave assistance for banks. Basically, what they did was to clean their balance sheets of non-performance loans, which means that they basically exchanged bonds for non-performing loans, and so what they did was, when the banks fell into serious financial problems, the National Banking Commission intervened, cleaning their balance sheets with government funds, and then they could sold the banks to other investors, which usually were foreign banks.
To sum up our presentation on the Mexico peso crisis, or also known as the tequila effect, we have the three following conclusions. So in 1994, the Mexican government was supporting the exchange rate with the peso and US dollar. And they also ran out of reserves, which you cannot have in a government. Also, the NAFTA trade agreement went into effect, and this caused the peso to depreciate at a very, very fast rate. Also, this crisis was very notable because of the presence that the United States had. Also, the International Monetary Fund as an organization was very important in this crisis too, with the role it played. So basically, this crisis was caused by a lack of international reserves, devaluation of the local currency, the peso, and the strengthening of a foreign currency, the dollar. Thank you.